everybody, welcome to the Smell Podcast. I'm your host, Katie Boateng. This week, I'm excited to share with you all an interview with Dr. Rachel Herz. She's the author of The Scent of Desire, Discovering Our Enigmatic Sense of Smell. If you haven't read this book yet, I would highly suggest it as it discusses the psychology of smell and why it's so important. Her book also features a few stories about people with anosmia. I really appreciate the book because it does include those who suffer with a smell disorder, and I don't know about all of you, but any representation is always welcome so we can teach the larger world about what we go through. It's nice to read about a character that I can so closely relate with. Okay, so this is a description of the book. Shakespeare wrote that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but if you cannot smell, does the rose lose its sweetness? The first and definitive book on the psychology of smell, The Scent of Desire, traces the importance of smell in our lives, from nourishment to procreation to our relationships with the people closest to us and the world at large. Smell was the very first sense to evolve and is located in the same part of the brain that processes emotion, memory, and motivation. To our ancestors, the sense of smell wasn't just important, it was crucial to existence, and it remains so today. Our emotional, physical, even sexual lives are profoundly shaped by both our reactions to and interpretations of different smells. Why do some people like a certain smell and others hate it? Is smell personal or cultural? How does smell affect our choices and our daily lives? Rachel Herz explores these questions and examines the role smell plays in our lives and how this most essential of senses is imperative to our physical and emotional well-being. Herz investigates how our sense of smell functions, examines what purpose it serves, and shows how inextricably it is linked to our survival. She introduces us to people who have lost their ability to smell and shows how their experiences confirm the sense's importance by illuminating the traumatic effect its loss has on the quality of day-to-day living. Herz illustrates how profoundly scent and the sense of smell affect our daily lives with numerous examples and personal accounts based on her years of research. The wonders of our sense of smell are all explored in a compelling and engaging manner, from emotions and memory to aromatherapy and pheromones. For anyone who has ever wondered about human nature or been curious about the secrets of both the body and the mind, The Scent of Desire is a fascinating, down-to-earth tour of the psychology and biology of our most neglected sense, the sense of smell. Next up, we have some biographical information about Dr. Herz. Rachel Herz, PhD, has been recognized as the world's leading expert on the psychology of smell. Since 2000, she has been on the faculty of Brown University. Her prominence as one of the foremost experts on the sense of smell has led her to numerous radio and television interviews, including appearances on the Discovery Channel, ABC News, the BBC, National Public Radio, and the Learning Channel. Examples of her work have appeared in science museums around the country, and she is the subject of a Scientific American profile piece. Herz is regularly interviewed in a wide array of print media, ranging from The New Yorker and The New York Times to Time Magazine and the Oprah Magazine. All right, now that we know more about the book and its author, let's jump straight into the interview. Can you please tell us about yourself? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Montreal, and then I went to university also in Canada. I went in Ontario. I went to Queen's University for my undergraduate, and for my PhD, I went to the University of Toronto, and then I did a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, and my first academic job was at the Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia, which is a research institute devoted to studying the chemical senses, which are smell and taste, and also trigeminal irritation, which is the burn you feel from hot peppers.
Yeah, I've heard of the Monell Center before, and it's pretty close by to me, so I'm hoping I can go and visit it someday.
Well, actually, they have a whole project for anosmic, so I think it would really be worth your while. They have a lot of resources, and they have research ongoing about potentially helping people with anosmia, be able to cure their condition.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely check into that. So how did you get into the field of smell psychology?
Well, it was sort of from wandering aimlessly a little bit while I was in graduate school. I had done an undergraduate degree in biology, although for my final year and for my research honors project, I basically did it in the psychology department with what would now be called neuroscience, but then was called biopsychology. And so I had started sort of the psychology track at that point. And then when I started graduate school in the psychology department, I was trying to figure out how to marry biology and psychology together in a way that would make sense to me. And the long story short is that I stumbled across a paper in one of the courses I was taking where the researchers used smell to manipulate mood, and it was the first time this had ever been done. And they gave this little biological and evolutionary explanation about why smell would be such a good way to manipulate mood because of its basic and intimate and direct connections to the amygdala, which is where emotion is processed, and the hippocampus for associative learning and so forth. And this really struck me as a really wonderful way to bring my interests together. And so I embarked on this path, and my supervisor told me that, go do it, which is lucky that he said that as opposed to don't do it, because I don't do that. But he didn't know how to help me because no one actually was in this field at the University of Toronto. And in fact, I went to Brown University, where I'm currently affiliated, to meet the person who basically started the field of the psychological science of smell. That was Trig Engen, who is unfortunately no longer with us. And he was wonderful and incredibly generous and very, very helpful. And that set me on my way.
That's awesome. I was interested in speaking with you specifically about your book, The Scent of Desire, Discovering Our Enigmatic Sense of Smell. How did you decide to write that book?
Well, at the time, I actually thought that I was going to be leaving academia. I had actually been offered a job in industry, and as a function of the usual sort of ways things work in industry where things can happen at the very last minute, the company I was going to be working for was acquired by another company that then dissolved the division I was going to be heading. So I no longer had a job basically at the moment that I thought I was about to have a job, and I had told Brown I was no longer going to be there. And then I was sort of caught in this, between a rock and a hard place situation, and was able to sort of get a position that enabled me to stay within the sort of general infrastructure at Brown. But because I had been thinking very seriously that I was kind of leaving the whole academic research side of things, I felt like I needed to write sort of the book that would be the crowning of all that work that I had done in the sense of smell, because like I said, I thought I was going to be moving on to other things. And that was partly what gave me the motivation. The other thing was that I was actually asked to be an expert witness. It was the first time I'd ever done it in a lawsuit where a woman had lost her sense of smell in a car accident, and the insurance company was basically offering her a penny of, compensation, because unfortunately, even to this day, the American Medical Association only values loss of the sense of smell as between 1% and 5% of someone's life worth, whereas vision is valued at 85%. Right. And so my role in this case was to, on her behalf, try to make a case for the insurance company to give more compensation for her. And so I met her, although I never met her in person. I met her over the phone and in many phone calls. And her story really, really struck me and moved me and really brought home for me how devastating anosmia can be. And this is the outcome of her car accident. I mean, it had been a really bad car accident. She'd had several facial reconstructive surgeries and a bunch of other things. But this was over a year later, and she was sort of physically all put back together, except for the one lingering debilitation or loss from the accident was her sense of smell was gone. And listening to how she was struggling with life and how much of a negative turn her life had taken since this loss, and how she had never given her sense of smell any credit before. She had always taken it for granted. And it really made me feel compelled to let people know how important their sense of smell is so that they can cherish it while they have it.
Right. No, yeah, it definitely changes your life. Mine was, I had a post-viral infection, like I mentioned. And so that was, I think, late 2009. So it's been about 9 years now without a sense of smell. And I would definitely go back to having one.
Well, good. Well, there may be ways that you can, post-viral is probably a lot better than having a traumatic accident where there's more damage to the brain and also to the bone that separates the brain from the olfactory neurons. And so you probably have a chance of being able to regain your sense of smell.
That would be awesome.
I would look into that.
Yeah. In your book, you also talk about, you state that our sense of smell is tied to our emotions, our memories, our behaviors, and our health, pretty much everything. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, sure. So basically, like I said before, our sense of smell is directly, once, we smell something and it goes into the olfactory bulbs, which are the blueberry-sized extensions of the brain. They're basically at the level of the eyebrow. And then that information in the olfactory bulbs goes inside the sort of main part of the brain and goes directly into the limbic system, and specifically the amygdala first and then the hippocampus. And the amygdala is where our emotions are experienced and processed. And we have this immediate emotional response when we have a smell around us, and it's, whether it's just a kind of a good bad sensation or something much more involved and full-blown and evocative. And as a function of the fact that we have this really direct, intimate connection between our ability to smell and what's going on with us emotionally, one of the major things that happens when you lose your sense of smell is that your emotional system can become really derailed. And there really is sort of a feedback between both the emotional system and the olfactory system going on all the time, because also, very interestingly, people who have depression often during their episodes of depression complain that they feel like their sense of smell is weaker. So the two things are feedbacking on each other constantly. And when one side of the equation starts to derail, the other side starts to suffer. And so that's one way very deeply through which our emotional system can become negatively impacted by losing our sense of smell. And the other unfortunate thing, and of course this isn't for everybody, but the longer you have gone without a sense of smell, the more the part of the brain that's involved with emotion, that is the amygdala and so on, that area can become sort of increasingly disturbed. It's not necessarily the case for everybody, but it can certainly lead to worsening depression in a certain subset of people. And I've certainly witnessed that in people that I've dealt with, where as a function of time, it's actually getting worse and not better. Mm-hmm. So that's the emotional piece of it. The second piece of it, which is deeply connected to the emotion, is how our memories are involved in our sense of smell, and they're also completely intrinsic to our sense of self. If we didn't have autobiographical memories, we really wouldn't have a sense of who we are. We are a collection of our kind of autobiographical memory narratives that we are constantly building on through new experiences and then thinking back on and weaving back into our current life and so forth. And smell is a really, really powerful trigger for those autobiographical memories. And not so much because it, makes you think of something that happened to you in the past more accurately, but because the emotion that's brought back with that memory and the evocativeness, the feeling of being back in that same time and place when it happened is more powerful. And I've done research showing both of those things when you have a smell triggering a memory than when you have any other kind of sensory experience triggering a memory. And it's also the case that because smells can be really unique in terms of our experience of them, you could only come across a certain smell once in your life. And in that way, they can actually be cues for memories that we might otherwise actually never remember. So that is to say, if you didn't come across that smell again, you might totally forget this little episode of your past. And so not only are they able to bring back more emotional and evocative memories, but they're capable of bringing back memories that can unlock pieces of our past that we might not otherwise have. And because our memories are so tied to our sense of self and identity and our general psychological well-being, that's another way that, smell is so critical to all these aspects of emotional health.
So one thing in the book that I found was very entertaining was the intern that you had who went to the aromatherapy session and how you guys kind of had a mini experiment with that. So do you think that aromatherapy would be effective for people like me who have anosmia, or do you think the benefits come from actually smelling the scents that they're using?
So I would say that you have to be able to smell in order for any kind of aromatherapy. And I'm sure you know what my position on aromatherapy is, that it's not something pharmacological. It's not like there's a smell that's taking over your mind and body like a drug and making you feel this way, but rather it's through your past associations that you have with the smell, and especially in a relaxing context and getting a massage and so on. So certainly from the point of view of you could still get a massage and know the massage was nice and feel relaxed from the massage. But in terms of having the aroma connected to the massage have any added impact, and that would probably be especially for later. So for example, if the person who was doing the aromatherapy massage then gave you a vial of that particular fragrance that was used during that time, you could use that later to help you relax and feel the relaxing experience of the massage and so on. But if you can't smell, then that's not going to work. So you would be able to experience relaxation from the massage in and of itself and during the time and place, but just having that bottle with you afterwards, if you couldn't smell it, nothing will happen. And this sort of leads into another basic premise, which is that in order for aromas to have any impact, aromatherapeutically or otherwise, you have to be able to perceive them. So
Right.
if something is at a super, super low concentration, such that even if you have a normally functioning sense of smell, but you can't detect it because it's just too weak, you're not going to be able to smell you're not going to be able to get the benefits of that either. So you have to be able to actually perceive it. And there's another level of that at which, you're consciously aware of perceiving, so you're paying attention, and that makes it even more impactful. But you have to be able to detect it in the first place.
My next question for you is about the McClintock effect, actually. So can you explain what that is to us? What is the McClintock effect?
So the McClintock effect is named after Martha McClintock, who, when she was an undergraduate at Wesleyan College, first noticed through her own observation that women in the dormitory with her tended to have menstrual cycles around the same time. And so she then wanted to look into actually experimenting with this directly to see whether or not this was in fact a real phenomena. Now, her studies that she did initially and also subsequently, the ones that were conducted in her laboratory, seemed to suggest that there was a real phenomena happening, that women who were exposed to each other, and particularly it seemed the sweat from a woman, one particular one who was usually what was known as the driving female, would then set the endocrine hormonal systems of the other women around her to be following her, and such that women who were living together would generally start menstruating at the same time. So their cycles would be in sync with each other. Now, it has turned out, however, that in subsequent work, it does not appear that this is really the case. And first of all, just from a sort of a general psychology perspective, it's much more the case that people notice when something is happening than when something isn't happening. So if you live in a dormitory and you're like, oh, I have my period, and so does Susie, and so does Phyllis, and so does Linda, then you're going to be like, wow, there's something about this that's, we're all having our period together at the same time. But Mary and Jane and Heather and Susan might not be having their period at the same time as the rest of you. But you're not focusing in on that. So the other thing has to do with the statistical aspects of what wave functions are like. And a menstrual cycle is just that. It's a cycle. It's a wave function. And the sort of peaks of that cycle, that wave, are going to come in alignment with each other over periods of time when you have multiple cycles kind of happening at the same time. And then they're going to move out of phase with each other. So just statistically, over time, it's going to be the case that people's peak of their wave, and let's just call that peak the time of getting your period, are going to come in sync. And then they're going to move apart, and it has nothing to do with being exposed to any kind of human pheromone or the sweat of another, person and so forth. And so, and actually, just to sort of top off this damning future work, is that most recently, research that's been done to try to replicate the studies that Martha initially did have failed. So unfortunately, although it is a really kind of a nice, picture of things, and subjectively it certainly can seem like that, especially within a small group of people, because they're not taking the larger group into account where it may not be happening. Menstrual synchrony as some kind of a real phenomena doesn't seem to exist. And there are no pheromonal effects in humans, because that was the one that was touted as, this is an example of pheromones working in humans. And although, the sex ones may not be working so much, this is working. And I should also point out that in animals, it is the case that, for instance, females will often come into estrus at the same time. Now, estrus is kind of the opposite of a menstrual cycle, because estrus is everyone coming into fertility at the same moment. And often animals that are communal will actually become fertile all at the same time. But in the case of, and when I say animals, I mean certain mammals, not all animals, but it does not seem to be that either that humans have any connection to doing this behavior at all, other than kind of the anecdote of experience.
Yeah, when your explanation definitely helps me understand that, because while I was reading your book, I just kept thinking to myself, what would happen if this study was tested on anosmic women, if it would work or not. But the way that you explain it, it makes sense that it probably would. We would probably still sync up with other women that we were living with.
Exactly. And, that's actually a really nice thought that maybe from an experimental perspective, someone could look into this from that. That would sort of be another way of demonstrating that it doesn't have anything to do with olfaction, at least not at a conscious level. So, but that's a nice idea. So yes, you would still feel the menstrual synchrony effect was potentially happening if you lived with a group of other young women, but in actuality, it would either be a statistical artifact or just something that you're noticing because of the social connection in the group.
Interesting. Okay, so my next question is the trigeminal nerve. So what is the trigeminal nerve, and does it work in people who have anosmia?
So the trigeminal system is a separate system that is in the face and also in the mouth and in the eyes, and it responds to irritation or pain. So, for example, the trigeminal system, part of the nerve there, it's one of the cranial nerves, and it's cranial nerve 5, if that is important to anybody. It's what makes you feel hot peppers when you are eating, biting into a habanero, that burning sensation in your mouth, that's due to the trigeminal system. When your nose starts getting irritated also from the sort of the chemicals that are coming from the hot pepper, or if you inhale ammonia, that's the trigeminal system. When you're chopping onions and your eyes tear, that's actually the trigeminal system. And even the pain that you can get from migraines across the top of the forehead, that's also due to the trigeminal system. So basically, it's a pain sensing system that responds to chemicals. And another way that it can respond, not just in terms of pain, but it can also be other forms of sensation. So like menthol or mints have that cooling sensation in your mouth or in your nose, and that's also trigeminal. So the trigeminal system is independent of the sense of smell. And the thing is that many odors, even most odors, have at least, or rather I should say, almost all odors except for vanillin and a certain kind of synthetic rose scent and actually hydrogen sulfide. All of them, apart from that, have at least a small degree of trigeminal stimulation at the same time. So when you're smelling something, like let's say you're smelling let me think of something that would be a good example. Like, let's say, I'll go back to the mint case because that's a really strong one and it's pretty obvious. But when people smell mint and they feel the cooling sensation, it can feel, because the cooling sensation's in your nose, that you're smelling the cooling. But really, you're only smelling the mint, and the cooling is happening at the same time because the aroma chemicals from the mint are also triggering the trigeminal system to react. So they feel like they're going together, but they're not. And so I would say from the point of view of having anosmia, it would actually depend on what sort of caused the anosmia, because it could be possible, depending upon what caused the anosmia, that the trigeminal nerve inside the nose, that could also be affected. So it could have been damaged too. But it's also just as likely that it wouldn't be affected. And in fact, one of the ways of determining whether or not someone has anosmia or not is whether or not they can feel, for example, which nostril an odor is being sent to. So if I had something like Vicks or something like a eucalyptus type scent, which has a trigeminal quality to it, and you were blindfolded, and I presented it to both your nostrils, and you could tell me which nostril it was, then that would indicate that you would have a trigeminal response to it. But whether or not it also, whether it's affected in anosmia, I think has to do with the kind of anosmia you would have. So I think you can still feel, like, for example, if it was more of a brain effect that your anosmia was at the level of, then you should certainly still be able to feel inside your nose. But if you'd had damage inside your nose, it's possible that you wouldn't get that sensation either.
For me, my husband once made stir-fried rice for us to have, and he likes habanero peppers. The whole time that I've known him, I haven't had a sense of smell. So I was eating dinner, and usually he wouldn't put as many peppers in there. And for some reason he did, and I ate the food and then immediately had that reaction of having a habanero, like almost a whole habanero pepper go down my throat. But it was really weird because I couldn't smell it, but I was still having all of that reaction. So it was just it was an interesting situation for me.
So could you feel it in your mouth though, but not in your nose? Is that how you mean it?
Yeah. So when I ate the pepper, it was like burning in my throat and my tongue kind of, but I didn't smell anything. But
Right.
it was still like burning.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So, but was it burning in your nose too?
No.
Okay, so maybe because of your viral infection in your nose, also the trigeminal system or the innervations from the trigeminal nerve in your nose may also have been affected. Sounds like they were, but not the ones in your mouth. So that would make sense.
That's really interesting. Okay, my final question for you. If you could conduct one research study on people who have anosmia, like complete anosmia, what would you want to know, or what would you be interested in studying?
Well, I mean, I would probably need more time to come up with a more brilliant response. But in terms of just sort of off the top of my head, because I'm so interested in the emotional and memory aspects of our olfactory system, I would really like to explore further the emotional memory experiences of people with anosmia, and potentially not so much giving them smells, because obviously that wouldn't work, but kind of just delving further into what their emotional being is like and how long they've had anosmia for, what kind of anosmia it is, how it occurred, and so forth, and seeing whether or not I could do some sort of a study where I could maybe track these people over a period of time to see how their emotional life may or may not be changing and how it is changing, and comparing that to people who have a sense of smell and looking at sort of, I guess the idea would be for this kind of longitudinal study. So if I could follow people for, 20 years, and if I had a big enough number of those people to look at how, their emotional lives were progressing or varying in comparison to each other.
Yeah, and then I wonder in that instance, would it be okay for you to include people who had congenital anosmia or only those who had acquired? Because I just personally, and I'm not a scientist at all, but I would think that the ones who had acquired anosmia would have a worse emotional state than those who have congenital.
Yes, I completely agree with you, and that's certainly from my own personal experience talking to people who have congenital anosmia versus those who have acquired anosmia. People who have congenital anosmia, say to me that they think their emotional life is completely fine, and sometimes seem almost offended that I have suggested that they may be somehow suffering. But I actually, in my, again, personal opinion of those people, is that they seem to have a fairly flat affect. They're not really emotional personalities. And I would say that actually is also to do with their lack of sense of smell. And so not so much that they're suffering from any kind of depression, but their sort of lowered sort of emotional temperature overall, I still think has to do with them not having a sense of smell, and in their case from birth. So they're not suffering, in a sense, the loss of something they once had, and that is from the life already lived with a sense of smell. I think the way that things are interconnected in the brain with respect to emotion and scent and so forth are different than if you've never had it. So it's certainly a different story, but I still think that there is a piece of that is involved with having congenital anosmia, and it just manifests differently.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would definitely read your study.
Well, if I can also mention something else, and I don't know if you want to put this on your podcast, but
please.
It was recently brought to my attention, and it has been before when I've given these talks, but also I wrote something for something called the Fifth Sense, which is an anosmia organization, charitable organization in the UK. And someone contacted me who has anosmia acquired and is also, in their self-definition, asexual. And I've had other people approach me who have acquired anosmia tell me that they, or even just a really weak sense of smell, that they are asexual. And I again, kind of interconnected, not only with emotion, but also in terms of sort of how odors can be really powerful triggers of desire. They can also be really potent barriers to wanting intimacy. I would be really interested in looking at the connection between weakened sense of smell or acquired anosmia and sort of self-reported sexual state or sexual personality. So that's something that I'm interested in looking into too, to see if that is really, more than just an anecdote that a few people have told me, so it seems like they're connected.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting study. If you were looking for participants, the Facebook pages, there's a few Facebook groups of people with anosmia, so that might be a good place to recruit if you ever do that in the future.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that would be great.
So those are all the questions that I had. And do you have anything else you'd like listeners to know, or how can they get a hold of you?
Well, they can go to my website, which is www.rachelherz.com. And in addition to being the author of The Scent of Desire that came out over 2007, so over 10 years ago now, I have a new book, which is called Why You Eat, What You Eat. And it also talks about anosmia in there as well. In fact, one of my main characters in Why You Eat, What You Eat also has lost their sense of smell, and it's the struggles in that particular case that they have with food. And I also suggest ways in which people can augment their experience of food even though they don't have a sense of smell. So that could also possibly be helpful for people who've lost their sense of smell.
I'm definitely going to check that out. I hadn't read that one yet.
Okay,
well,
great.
Thank you so much for all of your time and for speaking with me today.
And thank you so much for interviewing me and for your interest.
Thanks to Dr. Herz for being so willing to be interviewed for the show. If you'd like to learn more about her and her book, please visit www.rachelherz.com. I'll post the links in the show notes for today's episode. You can also find her on Twitter at Rachel_Herz, and she spells Rachel RACHEL_HERZ. What do you think about what she had to say? Have you already read this book, The Scent of Desire? And if not, are you planning on reading it now? I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to check out the Identifying Treatments for Taste and Smell Disorders conference website, and hopefully we can all meet each other at the conference this November. As a reminder, you do need to register ahead of time, but the conference is free. If you can only attend one day, go on Thursday because that day will be specifically tailored for patients. If you'd like to be featured on the podcast, either in an interview or as a part of a Listener Stories minisode, please send me an email to thesmellpodcast@gmail.com or visit me on Twitter at thesmellpodcast. Until next time, have a great day.